And welcome to the fourth meeting of the committee in 2020. I'd like to remind members and the public to turn off mobile phones, and anyone using electronic devices to access committee papers should please ensure that they're turned to silent. We have received apologies today from Mike Rumbles, MSP. Our first agenda item today is evidence on the draft census order, and can I welcome witnesses to the meeting? Fiona Hislop, Cabinet Secretary for Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs, Scott Matheson, Senior Principal Legal Officer for the Scottish Government, Pete Whitehouse, Director of Statistical Services with National Records of Scotland, Scott McEwen, Head of Policy and Legislation for Scotland Census 2021 at the National Records of Scotland, and Jill Morton, Senior Business Lead Questions and Collection Instruments with the National Records of Scotland. Members will be aware that the draft Census Order 2020 was laid in the Scottish Parliament on the 23rd of January, and a copy of the instrument is provided in today's meeting papers. The committee's consideration of the draft Census Order will follow the parliamentary process that is used for an affirmative instrument. The session today provides an opportunity for the committee to take evidence from the Cabinet Secretary on the draft order. The committee will have an opportunity to vote on the draft order at a later meeting. And can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement, no longer than 3 or 4 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Convener. I am appearing here at committee today as the Census Scotland order, as the Convener has stated, has now formally been laid in draft before Parliament. We're therefore at a critical time for Scotland's 2021 census. It is of significant importance that the committee gives this census order due consideration before it progresses to the Parliament chamber for approval. For previous censuses, laying of the formal draft order would be the first point in the process at which the committee would have had sight of the proposed census order. However, for the Census 2021 legislation, National Records of Scotland provided the committee with early sight of the draft census order in September of last year as part of an informal engagement process with this committee. In fact, that engagement has been ongoing since June of last year, over 6 months now. This committee took evidence from officials in September, and earlier this month, members have also had access to a number of documents to support this early consideration, including drafts of the proposed questions for 2021 and all impact assessments. A demonstration of the online collection platform was also provided in September. National Records of Scotland provided written responses in October to all questions members from the, had at the evidence session and demonstration, and most recently attended a committee evidence session on the 9th of January. My letter earlier this week provided further information requested by the committee following that session. So this new approach follows parliamentary committee recommendations from the last census to improve the process and enabled a pre-scrutiny element for the respective committee. This was to allow any issues to be resolved before the formal process begins, therefore reducing the risk of problems and delays during the formal period. That is why National Records of Scotland have been very keen to engage with the committee over recent months and provide information to support your considerations. We need to have all the census legislation in force before summer recess of Parliament this year, and the current process would allow for that. The first timing pressure for the legislation is the requirement to have questions agreed so that the online collection platform can be built for 2021. We must ensure that legislation is passed so that the timetable can be maintained, and failure to do so would put at risk the delivery of a census in March 2021. So given that the Scotland's 2021 census is digital first, being predominantly online, this is a critical part of the preparations. Therefore, the regulations that follow the order need to be enforced, as these will set out the format of these questions at the level of detail necessary for building the online platform. So I'd like to take this opportunity again to briefly highlight why it's so important to support Scotland's census, which will be held on Sunday, the 21st of March 2021, subject, of course, to Scottish Parliament approval of the order. Scotland has relied on the information the census gives us for over 200 years, and it provides vital information that government, councils, the National Health Service and other users need. The information gathered from the census helps us to understand who we are in Scotland, how we live and work, and how we change and grow, and the services we need. The key quality aspects of census data are that it has to be able to count the whole population, it has to be credible, people have to have confidence in it, and that factors such as consistency over time and comparability across the UK to inform collection and census outputs exist. I'm very proud of the richness of data that is held and the consistency of approach that can be demonstrated over these 200 years. And that is why National Records of Scotland has worked hard to ensure that the questions being proposed for 2021 will provide accurate and reliable outputs. So I hope we can reach agreement on approving the census order in the next few weeks we have for the process. I think we can all recognise the importance of the census in providing information about a complex and changing Scotland. So it's in our hands collectively to ensure that the 2021 census continues to deliver for Scotland.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. As you're well aware, this committee has spent some time looking at the sex question on the census and the guidance which was introduced in 2011 without consultation, which suggests that the question should be answered on the basis of how one felt as opposed to one's birth sex, and that did not require a gender recognition certificate if how one felt was different from one's birth sex, and that has caused quite a big debate, a national debate. Last year, Professor Alice Sullivan from the Centre of Longitudinal Studies at the University College London, and she's the director of the British Cohort Study, sent a letter to the Prime Minister, the First Minister and the census authorities across the UK, signed by 80 very prominent academics who use population data, who are social scientists, raising serious concerns about the guidance. They point out, and I'll just quote, it acts to conflate two distinct characteristics, sex and gender reassignment, both protected characteristics under the Equality Act, and will effectively transform the long-standing sex question into a question about gender identity. We are concerned this will acutely undermine data reliability on a key demographic variable and damage our ability to both capture and remedy sex-based discrimination. And they say that that includes different health and socio-economic outcomes between men and women. And they go on to say that they welcome the new transgender question, which of course this committee unanimously approved of on a voluntary basis. They welcome the new transgender question and say there's now no justification for advising respondents to give inaccurate answers to the sex question. And you'll be aware that Professor Susan McVeigh, who advises the government in Scotland on statistics, told this committee that she believed that the 2011 guidance, which was introduced without consultation, was a mistake. So I guess what my first question is, these are very prominent academics, and it seems very strange that their views don't seem to be taken into account.
Okay, well, I suppose you understand this, but for those that are perhaps watching this or for the official records, I think it's important to stress and state that the guidance is not part of the order that has been formally laid. The guidance is separate from that, and I think you all understand that, but I think it's important to put that on the record. Of course, there's been a lot of attention on the guidance. The issue about the census is that it is, and always has been, self-completion. So people will have completed it in the way that they themselves think and they themselves want to present as. We know that for the vast majority of people, they will not even look at the guidance, and that's important data that we've got from the rehearsal, but also from the subsequent research that was taking place. So our understanding from that information is that 99.5% of people won't look at the guidance. They pass the guidance by. I think during the rehearsal there was only about 50 odd references to the guidance as part of that. So for the vast majority of people, we know from the experience that NRS has that they won't look at the guidance, they'll just fill it in, and they'll fill it in on a self-completion basis, but they'll fill it in from their sex, and most people will do it from either biological or legal sex. But we know from also the previous early cognitive testing that people have a different understanding of sex when it's discussed with them as to what they would do, and most people would then think about it as whether it's my birth certificate or biology or whatever. Most people just do it very quickly and go through. The 0.5% of people that do refer to the guidance, that's where the identified need was. So the need was for people who are not clear about how they would want to answer that questions. That can be for a number of reasons, potentially non-binary, and we know that those that identify as non-binary would have concerns as to where they might go in the questionnaire that had a male, female. Those that transgender, those that, you know, just are not sure. So it's obviously it's for. So let's be clear: the guidance is for 0.5% of the people. I think society is changing, and I think the academics have got concerns about how they can interpret data in terms of predicting where the country will be in the future, or what are there trends, are the trends happening, and that's obviously kind of future considerations. We need to capture information as they are now. Now, in terms of the academics, I understand that there was a meeting with NRS and 3 of the professors, the Scottish professors, including Professor Susan McVeigh. As part of that discussion, there was obviously, they have a clear concern about the guidance which they've expressed. I'm not sure they've articulated what their replacement would be, but in terms of whether there should be guidance or not, there seems to be, my understanding is, an understanding from the academics that they would prefer to know the basis of the guidance than to have no guidance at all. And in relation to the letter that went to the Prime Minister, the more collective, because it's obviously not just National Records of Scotland that are producing a census, Northern Ireland is, and also ONS are doing that for the rest of the UK. So I understand, although I've not had minutes of it, that there was a meeting last week with the professor you referred to, and the different organisations that are looking at the census. So I can understand people are trying to look at this and saying, does this do a broad brush definition? The census doesn't define what sex is and never has done. It's always, you know, it's always just been on a self-completion basis. It's never said it's biological or it's legal or it's whatever. It's never said that. It's just said male or female. And that's the process that we intend to continue. That was the process to continue. There was an issue as to whether for this census there should be a non-binary question, there should be another, but obviously that's a question that was debated fully with the committee. There was debates in Parliament, and I wrote to the committees to say that we would maintain the position of having a male-female question as recommended by the committee. So that's the situation that we are just now. Obviously the engagement with the academics has to be serious. I expect that to be serious. The guidance, as I said, is separate from the order, and particularly at this time, because of the timings for the self-build and the build, not the self-build, but the build for the online questionnaire, I want to concentrate on making sure that the order is accurate and correct and reflects what people have said, and there are changes within that. But I understand there's debates, much wider debates about sex and gender taking place in other places for other reasons. That's not the role of the census. The census is to capture information and be quite specific about doing it. And for the vast majority of people, for 99.5% of the people, their interest is answering the question, which they do and do well. It's one of the best answered questions. But for the 0.5% of people that we understand need to look at guidance, that's why that's there.
I think the academics who wrote to the statistics authorities were very well aware of the guidance and how many people looked at it, and they were still very concerned at the outcomes. In your letter to the committee, you respond to my question, which independent academics and other data users who use census data to support the research have expressly stated their support for a self-ID sex question. And you mention public authorities, although it's not clear if they actually requested a self-identified sex question, but you do mention public authorities. But when it comes to independent academics, you refer to a group of 50 who wrote to the committee, as well as the in 20th of September 2019, as well as the Equality Network and LGBT Youth Scotland and Stonewall Scotland, who are not independent academic researchers. However, I just wanted to compare those two letters, the letter from the 50 academics that you mention and the letter led by Professor Alice Sullivan, because Professor Alice Sullivan's letter consists of 80 very senior academics, so mainly social scientists, mainly professors who work with population data. They include professors of research methodology, professors of population health, professors of medical sociology, professors of demography and statistics. The letter that you highlight as having influenced you includes there are some professors, and I'm sure that there are a small number of people who use population data, but it includes academics from departments of creative writing, Atlantic studies, theology, computer science, and linguistics. And it doesn't consist of the level of population data users. They are activists and they're absolutely entitled to their view, and I'm sure they're very accomplished in their fields, but they do not compare to these people whose specialism is using population data. And it does seem very strange that you have ignored one group of experts and preferred another group of activists when making your decision.
I think that's an opinion from yourself, convener. I'm not, in terms of giving importance or otherwise to different groups. As a government minister, of course I would listen to all those that put forward views, and not least very senior academics. That's why I think it was very important that as recently as, I think it was last week, but I'll get the date of it, that there has been a meeting from Professor Alice Sullivan and the relevant statistical authorities. In fact, if you look at my response to the committee about looking at the binary, having a binary question, but having for the 0.5% of people that are looking for guidance to have that on a self-identification basis, I did that prior to that meeting. So actually what influenced me, I'm not saying I was influenced, you're suggesting that I was influenced by one group of academic, you describe them as activists, as opposed to anything else. Actually, what I did do was look at the research that was conducted as to what would ensure the best completion rate and the best completion accuracy of the census, and that research was taking place, and that research was shared with the committee, and indeed I responded to the committee. But
the research does not show the best completion rate, because the research indicates that the general population sample of 2,000 plus people, there were 3% who may not complete the census if there was a sex-identified question there.
Well, you're extrapolating that you think it's because of a self-identification. There are lots of reasons why people might not complete the census, and there are people, for example...
No, but that's what they say. That's what the research actually says, that there were a percentage of people for whom they found that it may cause them not to complete the census.
That might be your interpretation, but can I give Pete the...
Thank you. So the basis is that question in past census and in testing is very well answered. So it's the second, in 2011, sex question was the second highest answered question. So there's no issue in terms of when the census is out about how people will respond to that and their willingness to take part in it. When one does a particularly focused piece of testing, which is a kind of in an isolated sort of context, where people are shown a certain question and asked to have a response to that with certain guidance, you will get lots of different reactions. Whether those are the same that would come through when you have a census with the legislative background to it, with the requirement to engage in it, and all the compelling work that we will be doing as NRS over the coming months to show the benefit of the census and the importance of how it counts and enables people across Scotland to be identified and to contribute. The evidence is that people respond to that question.
And I think the other thing to point out...
I'm sorry, but that's not what the report by ScotSen actually says.
I was reading, if we can get it to hand, you want to quote the bit, I'll get the information out. Yeah. You want to...
Maybe we can come back to that. But I just want to ask one final question in terms of the academics, is that you talked about society changing, and certainly I don't think that people back in 1921 or 31 thought that they were self-identifying their sex when they answered the question. However, The academics themselves, led by Professor Sullivan, who I understood hadn't got a response from NRS, but perhaps you could tell me the exact date when she met you. In their letter, they warn of the extreme consequences of subgroups, not the general population, but the effect of subgroups self-identifying their sex in terms of how that could affect understanding of society. And they point out that this isn't a tiny number of people when it comes to certain subgroups. They point out in their letter, 1 in 50 male prisoners in England and Wales identify as transgender, and the Tavistock and Portman Trust claims that between 1.2% and 2.7% of children and young people are, quotes, gender diverse. So basically what they're saying is that this could have a significant effect on data when it comes to subsets of the population.
Can I just ask Pete to address the question about the professor and anything else you have on that?
So just on the sort of technical question on the response. So as the Cabinet Secretary said, the letter went to a number of individuals' offices, so First Minister, Prime Minister, the three Registrar Generals, as well as the Office of Statistical Regulation. So a response needs to cover all of those interests, so there's a bit of process to do that. There was a meeting...
So you're admitting that she didn't get a response?
No, but I'm just explaining where we are. So there has been a meeting with the Deputy National Statistician and with Professor Alice Sullivan, of which NRS phoned into, which happened last week, and Professor Sullivan was aware that this meeting was happening and was as happy to engage. And following that, the response is now being drafted to take account of those discussions as well. So dialogue is happening. What we've got is you've got a letter that went to 5 or 6 different offices across the UK and at different places where you have to talk to each other in order to respond. But absolutely, the engagement is continuing because that meeting happened with Ian Bell, the Deputy National Statistician.
The Deputy National Statistician, is that on a UK level or in Scotland?
He is the UK.
So she didn't actually, that meeting was arranged at UK level. She didn't actually get a direct response from anyone in Scotland.
They were part of the meeting, they were on the call. That happens frequently with UK offices. But if you send a letter to the UK Prime Minister and Scotland's First Minister, coordinating a response from the two, as you might realise, doesn't happen immediately, and it involves lots of different people. So I don't think we should question, I don't think you should make a judgment.
Okay, but she didn't have a meeting with anyone in Scotland. And just before I move on, a supplementary from Kenneth Gibson, the meeting that you did have with a couple of the signatories that you mentioned earlier was before Christmas, and that was with Professor McVeigh and 2 others. Basically, you produced a minute of that meeting that the academics themselves weren't happy with, and we have documentation which shows that, you know, there's obviously there isn't a lot of agreement there between yourselves and those academics.
I haven't met with them, but NRS have, and in terms of the minutes, I've questioned, you know, have we got a good understanding of what the different positions were, one of which obviously is, you know, is there guidance or not guidance, but I wasn't party to that meeting. But have the minutes, I've maybe asked Pete White House to see if the minutes of that now been agreed with those? Yeah,
so that, as you say, the meeting happened, which was very useful and helpful to us. NRS, as happens in lots of other organisations...
Sorry to stop you. You say it's useful and helpful to you, but it hasn't. What has it made you change? If it's useful and helpful, what have you changed as a result of that meeting?
There's been clarification in that meeting about the importance of guidance, and that is a valuable asset to people who look to use analysis. There was a conversation, which I think it was... Professor Nick Bailey, talking about some areas where guidance across the census might have been inconsistent, so we've tightened up some of that language. There was some broader discussions which I think probably reached into areas that were beyond the census, which are to do, as with the Cabinet Secretary has just mentioned, sort of wider discussions that are happening in society around how one deals with these.
So would you say they're happy with the meeting because they've disputed your own minute of the meeting?
No, what I was going to continue with is that as normal as our practice, NRS took a note. They provided that note to the other participants. They came back saying that they didn't agree with some of those points. What we did in order to be absolutely open on all of this is we provided the committee with that full narrative. So in the papers that we'd sent to you, I think a while back, it has our note, it has the comments that came back from Nick Bailey, the comments that came back from Susan McVie, our responses to that. All of that is packaged and provided to you. I think it's not the case that we are saying they're wrong, we're right, this is it. What we're giving to the committee is the full record of that engagement, and I think that's an honest approach to do.
Which probably shows that they're still not satisfied. But I'll bring in Kenneth Gibson now.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Cabinet Secretary, you said in a quote earlier on that the census does not define what sex is, and indeed in question 3 of the census, you know, the proposal is it will have female and male. But the current proposed guidance being tested then goes on to say, and I quote, if you're transgender, the answer you give can be different from what is on your birth certificate. You don't need a gender recognition certificate. So you also said this morning that it's important to capture accurate data. How does that help people how does that help capture accurate data when folk are effectively encouraged to put on that whatever they wish because they don't actually need to actually, you know, there's a conflation of sex and gender there, which the committee has debated long and hard, and the view of the committee is that sex and gender are not the same, and yet it seems to indicate in that question, which is being currently proposed, that the two are almost immutable, almost the same.
Well, for the vast majority of the population, it's not. For 99.5% of the population, we know that they will feel it. They will complete that. They will complete it as self-completion. Nobody. The issue about the census, it's you know, it's a civic responsibility. Everybody has to complete it. It's a requirement that people do complete it. There are certain areas, which is why the census order is here in front of you. There are certain questions that are mandatory. The sex question is mandatory. But in relation to the 0.5% of people that need guidance as to how they complete that, that is, it's always the census has always been on a self-completion basis. We can't go around to everybody's house and check, you know, have you filled this in accurately? So you're asking about accuracy. The accuracy is not something that is policed on an individual basis. We can't do that. In order to help people fill in the census, they have to know it's confidential. They have to know it's something they can fill in themselves, and they can fill in it honestly from their own perspective. And we require, and it's a civic responsibility for people in society to answer it honestly. Now, in terms of the aspects about, we know that there are people, and we know again from the testing that was done most recently, that 25% of those that access access the guidance really need to understand what they can and cannot do from their own perspective.
Yes, but I mean, given the fact that sex and gender are not the same, surely the alternative proposed guidance being tested, which is much clearer, which says the answer you provide should be the same as on your birth certificate. If you have a gender recognition certificate, you may record your recognised legal sex. I mean, the census then goes on in the following question to allow people to answer on the trans question. So I don't understand what the purpose would be of having guidance which effectively says to people, you know, it really doesn't matter what's on your birth certificate, you can just answer any way you like. I mean, how is that going to provide the accurate data which the academics that have been quoted by the convener actually says essential? And I know you've mentioned a number of times, Cabinet Secretary, 0.5% as if it's insignificant. That's still 27,000 people with Scottish population. You know, if it is even as low as 0.5%, so still that in itself is still a significant number of people.
Yeah, and that's why we want to capture them, and that's the issue, and that certainly was the discussions I recall from before 2011, was that there were people who didn't want to fill in the questionnaire and couldn't fill in the questionnaire because there wasn't somewhere for them to go. For transgender people, there wasn't somewhere that they could, you know, they could answer and have an understanding of how they could answer. And that's why that guidance was put forward in 2011, although, as the convener said, it wasn't tested at the time. It was, you know, that was something that was put forward by ONS as well. So I suppose it comes to the point about we want to improve the quantity and the quality of those that are completing. And if people get to the next question and they say, that's it, I can't answer this, I've got nowhere to go, then they'll stop completing the rest of it. And of course it's mandatory, and we want people to complete it. So we want to maximise the impact. So you're right, is does the 27,000, should we try and include them, or should we just say like we're not doing anything to give you help on that? And I think the other thing about the guidance that's quite important is because it's going to be online, we know that more people might require more help, and there'll be phone lines, and I visited the phone lines that took place during the rehearsal. Again, very small number of people on the rehearsal phoned up. I don't have the figure to hand, but on the guidance on this area, I think it was 50. I quoted it around about 50. I quoted earlier on. So it's in terms of the numbers. So do we want to include those 27,000 or not? Will having self-identification guidance for them help them complete that? I think the answer we know is yes. There are issues. We tested both the legal, because that was the other area that we were asked to look at in terms of the testing. And in terms of looking at the research, what would maximise the return to the census, then the self-identification guidance would have more of a return than having a legal guidance. And that's what the research shows us. And that's what I think we shared with you in early January.
I mean, I don't agree with there's nowhere to go, because the very next questions about whether what people's view, how people consider themselves in terms of their transgender identity or not, as the case may be. But the question...
Just on that, sorry.
So the question seems to me, I mean, if one reads the guidance which is being proposed, it appears to me that the Scottish Government doesn't believe that there's a difference between sex and gender. That's a clear implication from that question.
No, I don't agree with that, and that wasn't the case in 2011 either. I think some of the issues around the mandatory element of the sex questions had nowhere to go. So if it had been male, female, other, there would have been somewhere else to go. If on a mandatory question and it's online, male, female, if you don't complete that, you can't get to the transgender question. And we do want to get people to the transgender question precisely because of the concerns people have. We don't know how many transgender people are. We want to get that information. So the nature of the census means that you're going to have to be able to answer the male-female question before you get to the transgender question.
Okay, well, I'll ask the convener, because I know others want to speak, but why can't you answer that question? I mean, even if you feel yourself to be something other than the sex you were born with, I mean, surely you can still say what's on your birth certificate. I mean, what's the... I'm struggling to understand why you can't really do that, and it is compulsory, so surely it should be. Yeah. You would expect people to do that.
So I can correct me if I'm wrong from the officials here, but people could do that if they wanted to, and that's that some people, because that's precisely why it says and there is a transgender question coming, so that people know that they'll be able to put their transgender status in, because the next question coming is transgender. So some people may choose to then put the birth certificate on the first one and then the transgender on the second one. Some people might do that. Some people might decide that no, this is in terms of it's whether it's on it's on their passport, whether it's whether they have a gender recognition certificate or not. They may want to put something as to what their position and their lived sex is as of now. But the transgender question can only be got to if you fill in the male-female question.
Okay, thanks. Thank
you. Claire Baker.
Thank you, Convener. One thing we've heard through the course of the evidence session is that the case that's been put is that the question has always been a self-identification question. I think some people would challenge the conflation of self-completion and self-identification. And I'm not sure that everyone at the committee is convinced that in 1950, 1960, 1970, 1910, that there was really much confusion in people's minds when they had to answer the sex question. So it's difficult to accept the argument this has always been a self-identification. It has always been self-completion, and I do accept the case it's not always been checked. But to describe it as self-identification is quite a modern term. To go back to the issue of guidance, so if we go back to 2001, because there was no guidance. So one of the questions is the committee did ask for no guidance to be tested, and that wasn't tested during the Scott-Sen report. There was collection of evidence of who didn't look at the guidance, but the guidance was available to look at. So in 2001, there was no guidance. The committee would be keen to know why that hasn't been tested or considered. And then in 2001, my understanding is what happened, is that somebody queried the question and contacted ONS for advice, for advice about how to answer that question. The advice, I think, was then sent on email, or it was a verbal advice. How was that decision taken, what the advice in 2001 was going to be given, because that is what created the sequence. In 2001, I think someone was advised they could self-identify with that question. And in 2011, the guidance appeared with no consultation, and now we're at this stage. So
Okay,
how
can I
did
just say that 2001 is definitely before my time on this, so I do know that, and this is again just from my own recollection at the time when the census was going through. Obviously, every census has different issues and controversies. Last time round, I think it was Scots language, and then I think in 2001 it was more the ethnicity question that had a lot of focus. But I do remember that there was identified a need for advice because some people were querying it, and of course, if you're at the end of a phone, well, you know, or you're one of the enumerators going round and somebody asks you that, you know, what do you say? I mean, you say nothing, etc. And your initial point about self-completion being the same as self-identification, I agree. I don't think you can, you know, say both the same thing, but it's always been on the basis that we trust what people say, and people just have to, you know, they complete as they see it. I think it would be wrong to say in 1921 and 1931 there weren't any members of society that weren't trans, you know. So
I accept there were people who were trans,
yeah,
but
exactly.
I think the underlying understanding of what sex meant at that time, I think we can't tell. I suppose we could look back at previous census, but we can't tell as part of NRS's argument. I think people still understood what sex, what it meant in terms of I think it was still recognised as a biological sex, even if people didn't feel that was the sex that they belonged to. And I do accept we're trans individuals. I think the understanding of it is different.
And that's what we're trying to do, is to find out, you know, for those that, whether it was in 1921, 1931, or whether it is in 2021, you know, if you're trans, how do you answer this question? That's what this is about. For the vast majority of the population, they will self-complete, and they will decide themselves how they complete that. And the vast majority of people will complete it without looking at the guidance, which I think is the point about what we do know is that there, from the testing that has been done, that the vast majority of people don't look at guidance, right? So is that testing of no guidance, the fact that nobody looks at it, shows that they can still complete it? I understand back in August 2017, when the really early initial work was taking place, there was some cognitive testing that didn't have guidance, and also that there was subsequent quantitative household testing at that point. But perhaps one of the NRS colleagues might help with that.
Yeah. Yes, one of the early starting places with the development of the questions was cognitive testing, where people were presented with a question with absolutely no supporting material. And I think what we found in that is similar to what we've found all the way through. For the vast majority of the population, they see a question on sex, they don't query it, we tick it as standard with our answer. For a small number of the population, the concept is not necessarily straightforward, and they want their response to us is, you know, what do you mean by this question? What are you asking me? Is there guidance I can look at? So that was very early in the starting point. In the large-scale quantitative testing across a whole number of questions that we undertook in 2017, 2018, none of that had question guidance supporting the material, the questions either. So there has been testing of the questions with no guidance. The last lot of testing that was published at the end of last year was specifically trying to replicate census conditions, the environment where people receive a survey to complete in their own home, largely unsupported. And that was specifically to try and understand, do people use the guidance, who uses the guidance, what would be the impact of different versions of the guidance, and that's what that piece of testing, the most recent piece of testing, did achieve.
To return to one of the questions the convener raised around non-response, I think the stats that she is referring to was when the question was tested with male and female who were then shown the guidance and seeing what impact the guidance would have on their response rates. So it was table, I don't know if you have the copy with you, it was table 316, so 316. The females, there was, when the self-identification guidance was presented along with the question, there was 4% females thought it was unacceptable, 7% males thought it was unacceptable, and 2% for both as a non-response kind of rate. And similar figures when people were presented with legal sex guidance. It was 5% female thought that was unacceptable, 6% male, and 2% who were non-response. Do you have concerns about these figures or about the possibility of non-response? It's been more, because guidance is presented, it might make it more difficult for some other people to answer the question. And I know there's the argument that the majority of people don't look at the guidance, but as it's a digital first survey, I'm assuming, I think the convener and I did see the trial run of the digital version. You can see that there's guidance available. People might, out of interest, click on the guidance. Is that going to influence how confident they feel in responding to it?
Well, I think it goes back to the point that that testing was in particular circumstances to show what people, to show what people's responses were if they saw the guidance. What we know from the census completion, because we've had rehearsals of that as well, that only 50 people out of how many people did the rehearsal? Do you remember? It was in thousands. It was
thousands.
It was in thousands. But there was 50 people looked at it.
72,000 households.
72,000, yeah. So the number of people looking at the guidance. So the difference, the 3% figure is when people are presented proactively with the guidance, and then given their views, etc. It also is in the context that it's not the actual census that is a it's a requirement by law, that it is mandatory, that if you're filling it in you won't be able to progress. So I don't think you can have a read across from that to actual rehearsal, the rehearsal experience, which is more accurate as to how people would actually receive it in practice, where actually only a few people looked at the guidance. So you're comparing two different things. One, when you've got everybody looking at all the guidance, and then the real life situation where we know that people won't necessarily look at the guidance. And there's a difference when people know, because a lot of you look at, if you look at that bit of report, it talks about people saying, well, I'm not going to continue on to the rest of it, or I'd like to prefer to skip this question. Well, there is no skipping in the actual census, but that's actually what people were saying studying that. I think that's my understanding of that report.
And finally, Kavira, can I just go back to the initial question that I started with around the guidance and around the 2001 situation? Can you explain how, when this guidance is published, how, the question is more for sorry, I always get the acronym. When somebody phones or contacts or emails, what is the process for agreeing what guidance or what additional advice is given out to someone? If they receive the census, they have all the published guidance, they still have a question. If they contact the organisation, because when they contacted in 2001, somebody was given a response. I'm not clear what because that's really when the guidance was created, advice was given out in 2001, how that came about, as that was a decision that should be the response to that initial query.
That's 19 years ago. I'm not sure that anybody
I don't know
was
if
in the
anybody
same
from,
position
or what would
we're
be
in.
is anybody from the organisation able to explain that?
What
or
happens now then in terms of
what would be the current system for
advice?
Yeah,
advice?
Yes, I can't talk to 2001, but in general what would have been happening is that people would either phone up a help desk, or there is written material that shows this is the guidance for whatever question it is, and people interpret. If they need further advice, they would probably have spoken to field force people who were handing out forms in the past, which is totally different to how we feel most people will go through the census this time, or they may have phoned up a help centre, contact centre. Moving to 2021, people will be able to access the guidance online. They will no doubt be able to speak to field force people who are in and around their area if they're filling in the form on paper, or they can phone up a contact centre. And what we're trying to do is ensure that the advice that is given is consistent across all of those platforms, so that there is clarity on how people should access that question.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Donald Cameron.
Thank you, convener, and morning. I'd like to explore two issues, some of which have already cropped up this morning. The first is around consistency, and it strikes me that one of the most compelling arguments for the guidance as proposed is consistency with the rest of the United Kingdom, given that there is a census also in England, Wales and Northern Ireland next year. Can I ask the panel if they are aware of what the other devolved nations are doing in respect of the census around the issue around the sex question? If they've had, if they've liaised with them, because it strikes me that this debate must be happening there too.
The answer is yes, there has been regular contact, and obviously they monitor what we're doing, vice versa. One of the arguments is to have that consistency for comparability. I think, to be fair, and I think it's probably because of the endeavours of this committee, there's been more, I think, scrutiny or questioning, and indeed more additional testing that we've done in Scotland that they haven't done. But we came to decisions, I suppose, independently, but also read across, because obviously in terms of professional statisticians, etc., NRS will want to know what ONS are doing and vice versa. So it's something as a minister I've kept an interest in as to what the other administrations are doing. Obviously, England and Wales are with the ONS, and they're carrying out the same questions with the same guidance, as in a binary question with self-identification for the small number of people who want to access the guidance. And we understand Northern Ireland, if you can correct me if wrong, are actually doing the same as well. But it has been a bit of an iterative process where we've been checking what they're doing, they're checking what we're doing. So that's part of what we've been doing.
I mean, in light of that answer, is there any scope for divergence amongst the...
Absolutely. If we wanted to, we could. Yeah. But we've taken the decision because also, backed up by the research that we've been, just recently conducted, is what would maximise to allow the greatest quality and quantity of data to be captured. So it's not, we could if we wanted to, but actually it's made sense to be similar, and I think they reflect those views. I've not had the direct conversations with ONS. I don't know whether, Pete, you want to say anything about the relationship with ONS?
Yes, so we have a very strong and close dialogue with ONS and also with our colleagues in NISRA. What I would also say on that issue about comparability is the Office of Statistical Regulation, who oversee the branding of national statistics, and they have a UK-wide cover. They see UK comparability, and that consistency is hugely important. And so they hear a lot from users and interested parties on the ability to do that. So we are very, very mindful of enabling that to happen.
I think we should also maybe at this point add that obviously we've looked at what other countries have done, particularly on the digital first, because that's important. That's a massive step to have this digital first online. So obviously we've looked at what other countries are doing.
Thank you. There's obviously also a question of consistency with 2011 and what's happened before then, although I accept there are arguments that Claire Baker and others have raised about if there is no guidance, what are people actually doing when they fill it in? On the issue of no guidance, we've spoken about the testing or the failure to test the question, but just as a matter of principle, do you think having no guidance to the sex question is a viable way forward?
I don't think it would be viable in that those that use, and particularly academics that use the guidance, want to know on what basis the guidance is there, and on what basis that's been completed. But I also think that it's unfair to users who require. The whole point of this is we know that there are some users who need the guidance. So we'd just be saying, no, we're not going to service you. We're not going to support. We know that you've got a need, but we're not going to help you in filling in the census. So I think there's also a responsibility to them.
Do any of the rest of the panel have views on that?
I mean, just echo that point. I think we are providing guidance to enable all people across Scotland to engage with the census, and we have evidence that there is support required. So therefore, that is why, as it is with all other questions, that is the purpose of guidance, to help people who need that support to fully answer that question. And as the Cabinet Secretary has just mentioned, data users also feel valuable feel that it is valuable to understand the basis on which a question was asked. So those are, for me, two very compelling reasons to enable full completion, full access, full engagement with the census.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks. Can you just confirm that the letter from Professor Sullivan didn't express a view as to whether there should be guidance or not?
Sorry.
The letter from Professor Sullivan and the AT Academics didn't express a view as to whether or not there should be guidance. That's
I was
not been
referring
explored.
to the conversation, I mean, specifically I was referring to the conversation which is in the papers that were provided to the committee and the conversations we'd had with three of the academics who are based in Scotland who made that point in our discussion, and then our general understanding as government statisticians, as people who work with academics, with our general way of how we engage with data, understanding through the information that's provided in metadata and elsewhere, of saying this is the basis on which the question has been asked, is an absolutely massively important part of how analysts do their job.
Well, do you know, you say that they mentioned it in a conversation that they had with you, but their principal objection to the guidance, to self-identified guidance, we don't know whether if they had to choose between having self-identified guidance and no guidance at all. We don't know their view on that, those three academics, do we?
Well, nobody's saying that we do, unless you've had that.
Yeah, so we're going back to three academics as opposed to the 80 who wrote to you.
I don't want to undermine the reputation, the status of the three
Yeah.
Scottish academics. I think they're well respected.
Yeah.
And there is a general principle that any work that an analyst does, where they look at a data set, one of the things that they will do almost as a matter of course is they will understand the basis on which that evidence was collected. That happens if you look at health data, justice data, education data, survey data, administrative data. You will want to understand, what was this question asked? How was it asked? On what basis was it asked? That is what we're trying to do.
Okay. Annabel Ewing.
Convener, good morning, Cabinet Secretary and panel. Okay, picking up on some issues. I mean, on the issue of the dialogue with the independent academics, I mean, it has struck, I think, many members of the committee over the consideration of where we are now in the previous legislation that, you know, there was, it seems, on the part of NRS, a failure to really engage with people of that ilk early doors. And perhaps we would be in a different place now if that had happened. I don't know if maybe you'd like to get Mr Whitehouse to respond to it.
I'm not sure what people of that ilk...
Well, we're talking about these independent academics who are data users. They're the people that, you know, will be using the census data rather than people who are very, you know, august in their own fields, but perhaps day and daily are not using census data, I think, as the convener kind of referred to in her comment. So, you know, I mean, we can go back through all the official reports and our questioning of NRS. I mean, it does seem that, you know, the engagement with people who took a slightly different view, perhaps, was very late in the day. I just wonder why that was. I had asked Amy Wilson that question before at a previous session, but I didn't really ever get a very clear answer.
Two things, involvement in academics generally in preparation of the census, and then specifically about the sex question and on the guidance on the sex questions.
Well, yes, this issue where we are now, absolutely.
Involvement, I think that's what they were looking at. Yeah.
The approach of NRS has been open. It is open. We are an organisation that published and produced the census. We have not shied away from that. Anybody who wishes to engage with us over the last decade or before that, they know where we are. We are publicly available. We are coming to committee. There has been discussions on television, in newspapers. We have had lots of letters. People have engaged with the National Statistician, have engaged with Chief Statistician up here. We have been very open. We are there in Ladywell House and up the road. We're accessible. We have also carried out all sorts of testing. We've invited all sorts of different groups, different individuals to be part of that, and we have welcomed everybody's contribution. I have to say on behalf of NRS that the idea that we're not open and that we're not available to have discussions, I don't respectfully, I don't recognise that. I recognise that we are an organisation that has got a long history, that engages with with individuals and groups, however they come to us. So there were certain groups who engaged at a UK level. We have tried to access that because there's perhaps been a misunderstanding about Scotland's ability to run its own census. So we use our links with NISRA or with ONS to access those groups. There will be individuals and groups who came to yourselves as individuals or as a committee, and you have forwarded that information. We have engaged with that. We have also taken letters and emails and had lots of testing and public consultation on these issues. So I feel, unless there is other evidence that says that we've not done that, which I would want to look at, I feel that we have been incredibly open, as we are expected to.
Well, I hear what Mr Whitehouse says. I mean, obviously, I made the point of referring to early doors engagement, and I think if Mr Whitehouse wants to go back and look at the official reports of our committee deliberations over the piece, he will see exactly what I'm referring to. But moving on, we have on question 3, page 28, 2 guidance, let's call them A and B. One is current proposed and one is alternative proposed.
Sorry, can I ask what you're referring to?
Sorry, mandatory sex question number 3. We have the guidance, which is page 28 of the document supplied by NRS to us for this meeting. So there's, if we call them options A and B, we've got the 2 options, okay? And first of all, I would just like to seek clarification. I think we've been told that we won't see a final text until the autumn, and I just wonder why that is, because presumably, and the point well made by the CABSEC, with regard to another matter, that you need to have the text so you can get all this online. In regard to another issue, you mentioned that. So I assume this guidance is going to be available for online users. So presumably the same imperative applies. And therefore, why is it that we won't see this final text until, is it September?
So what I'm giving evidence today about is the draft order, and the draft order is the subjects. It's the first step in making sure that the content, there's agreed content, it's open to the committee to modify the content of the census, and what's in front of you will be in front of you when you vote in a few weeks' time. The parts that are in italic are what you can change. So there's that. Then there's the regulations. The regulations will have the actual questions, and it's the questions which will go. The plan is to take that. I think the Privy Council get that around April, in terms of. That's the census order, and it's the census. In fact, I think it's quite important to get the times of this accurate to make sure that everybody has got a good sense of the timing of that. I'm just trying to look to the figures on the timing. Right. So the. I understand, and it's obviously subject to the committee's timetable themselves, that you'll consider the draft census order, which is the subject matter of the census, on the Thursday the 27th of February, and the idea that would go to Parliament in March, with a view that the census order itself would go to the Privy Council on the 15th of April. After that, then you have regulations, and the regulations have to lie for 40 days, as you'll be familiar with, and the regulations have more of the questions on it. The guidance is completely separate again from the legal process that's in front of us. And obviously, in terms of guidance, there's always some flexibility and movement and finalisation of that. But for the build, which I think you're referring to, why is this important for the build? Obviously, from an IT point of view, it's the actual content of the questions that take you, the actual completion bits, which are the questions that are imperative for the build. The guidance, and officials might want to come in on this as well, the guidance is the text that goes around it, which is less of a, I suppose, from an IT point of view and a build point of view, less of an imperative, but the imperative absolutely has to be on the questions and having them ready. Sorry if that's quite long, okay. I thought it would be helpful to get the time.
Yeah, if I could clarify, I'm sorry, I understand, in fact, you had actually said in your letter to the committee, Cabinet Secretary, that the guidance, the final version, will be agreed by the end of summer this year. We had a discussion the last time that your officials were here about seeing a copy of the latest draft text. So what we have, as I say, is page 28 of this document provided by your officials, which provides an option A and option B at the moment. So, the option A is effectively self-ID and the option B is not. With regard to option A, I made this point to your officials a couple of weeks ago.
Sense, isn't it?
The Scottish Government has embarked on a consultation which effectively would move away from the current gender recognition certificate approach to effectively self-ID. So what my question is if that is the case, then how can a government document preempt the result of that process by effectively saying that for this purpose there will be a self-ID approach? That would be my concern, because that would seem to me potentially it could be argued to usurp the role of this Parliament. I mean, this is, you know, it's a guidance document. Nonetheless, it will be a document issued further to the Scottish Government. So if we're having a consultation about moving away from the current approach to self-ID, how can it be that we're inserting a self-ID approach in advance of that process?
Well, I think the census is a completely different issue and process than anything that is about what would a process about gender recognition or not. Remember, the census, people don't have to provide their birth certificate when they fill in their births. They don't have to provide a gender recognition certificate when they're filling in the sex question. They don't have to provide their birth certificate when they're answering male or female, if they're a male or female. It is about self-completion. So it's not policed, and it is really, really important that it is a confidential process and people feel there's a lot of sensitive information that people are being asked, not just in these questions. Obviously, we spent a lot on these questions. There are other questions as well. So it's not preempting anything, because in that case you would say that the 2011 did, and I think the 2011 wasn't in that.
Well, we've heard Cabinet Secretary that the 2011 text, there wasn't any consultation. And it was the first time that such an approach had been adopted since the census began 200 years ago, and also there was no consultation. So this is where we are now. We're having the consultation, which I think is a good thing. And my point remains that whatever, you know, the approach of an individual to responding to the mandatory question number 3, nonetheless, the guidance is a piece of paper issued further to the Scottish Government. It is pursuing, in terms of option A, a self-ID approach when we are having a consultation on self-ID that hasn't reached any, you know, definitive stage. And I just feel that we are preempting the role of this Parliament in that very, very important debate. If we pursue option A, of course, there is the alternative of option B, which reflects the current legal position, which I think is a much more appropriate route to go, because we you know, have to live within the context of the law as it currently is. You know, how then, in the months ahead, will there be, who will make the decision as between option A and option B, and on what basis?
So that is a question that NRS will consider. They will also you'll come to me, and I will have a decision on that as well. In relation to whether you require a gender recognition certificate to answer either the sex question, or indeed, by that logic, you're then saying the transgender question would require you could only complete that if you had a gender recognition certificate. And I'm not sure that that's what the committee's view was.
No, with respect, I mean, we're all absolutely supportive of the voluntary question on transgender and sexual orientation.
And do you think that,
well, with respect, I think the transgender question is entirely different. It is, I'm going back to Kevin Gibson's point, you know, whether you conflate sex and gender identity or you don't. And the voluntary question on transgender doesn't conflate that, it is gender. And question 3 is sex. I appreciate other members have questions, but just, so, you know, these are the issues I've raised, and obviously you want to go and reflect on all the issues raised by all members of the committee, I would imagine. But, you know, and a question I put to you officials, so if we get to the stage that for some reason the government picks option A, accepting what your official said, and Scott Matheson said the other week, that this would have no legal import for any wider debate on these issues whatsoever at all, would it not then be appropriate to make that absolutely explicitly clear in the text of the guidance? Sorry,
what do you want to make clear?
Well, if in the end of the day you pick option A, the government picks option A, I mean, the rest pick whoever picks it, it is preempting, in my view, it's jumping the gun on a debate that we're about to engage in, apparently. So, if it is the case that this is to be viewed simply as guidance, it's got no legal import and it doesn't matter, it's just for the purposes of making people feel happier when they're filling in a form, then would it not be appropriate to have a wee sentence to that effect in the text of the guidance? Is that something that will be considered by the NRS?
Well, everything can be considered in terms of the guidance, but it is a, you know, it's a recommendation in terms of, you know, how people can answer it. We're not saying you must answer it. This is the law. This is the. There's nothing in the guidance that says that this is has got a legal representation or a legal interpretation of what gender identification, self-identification is, or its status. That's not what the purpose of the guidance is. The guidance is to try and see if we can maximise the number of people that complete the questionnaire.
Well, I don't see, therefore, if the option A is the one that is picked, why it wouldn't be appropriate to just make that point as clear as the Cabinet Secretary's just made.
Okay, definitely hear the points that you're making.
Okay, thank you.
Very much. Just for clarity, did you say in response to Annabel Ewing there that you still had to make a decision on the guidance?
Well, I think we said that in the letters that we've given to you about the timescale for, I mean, it's all the guidance. You've seen, you've seen...
No, I'm talking about the sex question.
Yeah, well...
Are you saying you're still to make a decision?
Well, we've proposed, and I set that forward in the letter that I sent to you when we sent the results of the research, that we would have the binary question with, for those that need to access the guidance, which we think from the research we've done, it will be 0.5% of the population, will be done on a self-identification basis, which is the same as ONS and which is the same as Northern Ireland as well.
Yeah. Yeah, because that's what you're saying
That's a
in the
proposal.
policy impact report.
Yeah.
So you've already made the decision. So why can't you share the guidance with us?
But we have.
It's public, sorry.
Yeah.
No.
Sorry, you want to...
So the published report, which we provided to committee from our testing, which we gave in December, sets out our proposed guidance for the sex question. It says very clearly, this is our proposed sex question on online guidance for Scotland Census 2021.
Right. So that's not going to change.
That's our proposed
proposal, yeah.
guidance.
Right. Okay. Ross Greer.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to just turn to the first question that we asked in the letter to the Cabinet Secretary. So the conveners covered some of the points around the differing views that academics have around this question. So I'd be interested in the second part of that question around other data users, particularly organisational data users. And just to start off with public sector bodies, were any concerns raised by public sector bodies with this proposed approach to the sex question, or should I take from the answer in the written letter that they were content with the approach as proposed?
They were content.
Thank you. So in that case, to expand further, but again, sticking with organisations, looking at other organisations that make use of the data, charities, NGOs, businesses, etc. Would you be able to detail this, perhaps for officials, detail a little bit more the engagement with other organisational data users outside of the public sector and what their response was, again, whether they raised concerns or whether they were also content with this approach?
I'll ask Anna to answer that point, but I would reiterate that the major use on public sector in terms of service user need are the health service and also local government. That's like kind of in terms of how this data is used is very considerable. But in terms of whether NGOs, businesses, etc., that would access this.
Okay, so I'll just start, and maybe Jill can join in on this as well. So one of the pieces of work that we do to talk about why the census is so important is we talk about benefits of the census. And as part of that, we had plenty of feedback from the 2011 census about how people are using that in their communities to seek funding, to identify issues, to help do analysis across all the different variables of the census. So there's good information that we get or have had in the past on how various organisations, be those charity first sector, have made use of census data. There's the opportunity for people to have written to us or to express needs. I'm not personally aware of too much detail on that, but I am absolutely aware that I haven't had, just trying to think exactly on this, I've not received directly anything that says there is major concerns about how we are going about asking this question from third sector or charity groups that have previously successfully used the census, but perhaps Jill can...
Certainly. So I think part of the process, we started with a topic consultation, which was widely advertised. The Registrar General sent a lot of letters that was promoted to get a wide range of engagement. We got feedback on that, specifically looking at how people used, was the 2011 data that was collected, was that useful? Did it meet their needs? What would need to change? Following that, we had several years of stakeholder engagement. We, with both individual groups or collected groups of stakeholders together, we have had a range of public events where we have gone both Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, which are all publicly available and were promoted to get as many people as possible to sort of, and those public events are where we were putting our proposals forward with the question development, where we thought we were at with the questions. So there has been a wide range of engagement there, and
I think that answers more generally about all the questions, because obviously we're focusing, I'm not sure if your question was just about the sex question and what business organisations...
Primarily about the sex question, but obviously the overall context is explained.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's reflecting a bit what Annabelle Ewing was asking as well. I mean, because the question development starts way, way back, years and years ago, the topics are where they kind of get the main issues, and that's when people engage, and people proactively, and indeed those that have always had interest in the census will always engage very early, and they're interested in it. So that's where you got issues, for example, the veterans question. You know, that was coming forward from veterans groups, etc. So that's where people then scope what their interests are in. But I'm not sure. I think that's quite a general answer to what happens generally across the census. I think you're looking to go maybe focus in on that question.
I was going to follow up, but sorry, Ms. Morton, was I cutting you off?
No, you're fine.
Yeah. In that case, am I fair to characterise this in that whilst there's clearly a very substantial debate amongst academic data users on this, with organisational data users, concerns weren't raised. There's a contentment amongst organisational data users, particularly taking up the point the Cabinet Secretary made. The most substantial and consequential use of the data is by public sector bodies who are content with the approach as proposed. Is that a fair characterisation?
Yes, I think that is fair, but I wouldn't want to dismiss the needs of researchers and academics either. But some of that might be about how society is moving and changing. And I would reiterate that the census can't predict what the future is. The census has to reflect what we are now, and we can't see trends unless we capture where things are now.
Absolutely, thank you. To go back to the issue around a potential no guidance scenario, I accept that obviously before 2011 there was a de facto no guidance situation there. If a conscious decision were to be taken now, and I realise that's not what's being proposed, but taking this as a hypothetical, if a decision were taken to ask this question with no guidance, and someone were to receive the census, be unsure as to how they should answer it, and they were to phone the NRS and ask, how should I answer this question? What would happen if a decision had been made to have a no guidance scenario?
Okay, Pete, what would... I mean, it's hypothetical because that's what we're proposing.
I mean, I think that is absolutely a live question. Honestly, I don't really know how one responds to that, in that if we are saying there is, you know, in that hypothetical situation, there is no guidance and someone seeks guidance, we're in a bit of a catch-22 situation. I mean, they would have to do something.
Well, they would just say, I'm not allowed to say anything, or I can't tell you.
Yeah.
And then you said, well, it's up to you. And then it comes back to, I suppose, Claire's point. It's up to you means, is that self-completion or is that self-identification? It'll be how people interpret that themselves.
Yeah, and obviously there's a reputational issue there for the census itself, but also for NRS and the government if someone's phoning up asking for help and is unable to receive clarity on how to answer a question.
Yeah.
And just finally, on the testing, when the general population group, the Group of 2000, who were part of the ScotSend testing of this, what was the division between those who answered a paper copy of the census and those who used the digital version? Was that roughly 50-50 or?
I don't actually know that off the top of our head. We can come back.
I'll explain that. So the reason I'm asking that is I'm interested if there were any notable or significant differences between the two groups, those who were answering online and those who were answering the paper copy. But the division in testing would interest me, obviously, because the intention here is to have an overwhelming majority of people complete the census online.
Depending on what you're asking, but the rehearsal might actually give you better information as to how people responded, as to whether they, because some people could request obviously paper copies, And there, there's a differentiation at the rehearsal period, which was earlier in the autumn period, as to how people completed it. And that's where we know the information that 99.5% of people that are doing it online aren't looking at the guidance. That's a real live testing. The rehearsal probably is one of the strongest to see how people behave with guidance.
If that's not information you've got immediately to hand, I'm sure you can come back to us with it.
Well, sorry, I've located it now. So on table 3.2 of the Scott Sen methodology report, it's for the unweighted basis, roughly 50-50 response on paper and online. And there's no difference in who's identifying as male or female through either an online response or a paper response. It's about 50-50 as well.
And just as a methodological point, so it was about 50-50. Obviously, the intention for the census itself is for it not to be roughly 50-50 in completion rates, but both of those groups were still sound, large enough samples to be statistically valid. Each one was informative.
Absolutely,
yes,
yeah, but
yes.
the validity, as I think I said at the previous committee, Scott Sen carry out this work on behalf of us and did that to the methodological standards. We're content that it meets the criteria.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I know that Stuart's going to move on to another area of the census. Alexander, did you want to speak about the sex question? And I think it would be good to wrap that up before we move on to another area.
If I can come in, you've answered many things this morning, but the clear identity that we've got from here is that you want the most accurate information on all of this. And what we've heard already about the guidance and the lack of guidance, or the possibility of different types of guidance, and all of that has possibly confused the whole issue in many people's minds about where we're taking this. So can I just ask, when we did the testing, and you've done you said lots of different types in the rehearsal, all of that, online, the guidance is much more prominent when it comes up. It appears to not lead you, but it's there. It identifies that guidance is available when it comes to the question. And in the letter we got, the purpose of the testing from NCRs was to understand the manner in which respondents might take and make use of the guidance in the sex question. So from all of that, what have you identified? What has been the main issue from the guidance that has been placed with reference to that? Do you have any real situation or scenario that you can actually tell us today has been the purpose of that and has shown you what has been achieved when you've been doing that, the testing and the rehearsing through all of that?
Well, if we could say the report that was sent to the committee set out the responses, particularly around the Scott Sen research, was that the combination that would achieve the best response, as in more people filling it in and continuing, would be the binary question with self-identification guidance.
And from that, as I say, we understand that process is there and that will take place. But in reality, at the end of the day, with the individuals, the academics, everyone who's participated in this whole process, there is still an uneasiness, Cabinet Secretary, about that whole, the number of questions we've had today, the time we've spent on all of this, just identifies the difficulty that may be being anticipated when we come to doing the actual census itself, if the guidance and everything is not in place and covers exactly where everyone, because it's quite apparent that not everyone is happy with this whole process. And that's the problem we face.
Clearly.
And to try and unravel that, even today, we haven't seen, or I'm not as confident yet that we're at that stage of trying to unravel that to make sure we get the best data and the most accurate data at the end of the day.
Well, we've got to deal with the information that we have, the research we've done far more in looking at this than any other part of the UK and trying to understand that. I'm absolutely not dismissing the fact that there is a debate about this generally, but I think there's a danger people are conflating different debates. And my job, my responsibility as Government Minister in charge of the census is to make sure that we have a census that is delivered on time, that can have the maximum completion rates and that can be used primarily by the service users, but also by those that are trying to complete it. And that's my job. I'm not part I'm not there to lead debates in society. I've said that quite clearly way back at the beginning of the debates we've had in Parliament. It's not the job of the census to lead society. The job of the census is to capture information about how society is now.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a couple of supplementaries still on this topic. First from Claire Baker and then from Ross Greer.
Thank you, Convener. It was just to clarify, Mr Whitehouse said in terms of the two versions of guidance that we have been given, and it says the question is under development, but you've said that this is the proposed guidance. So I'm struggling to understand why we're still being presented with two, because you seem to be quite firm in saying this is the guidance we intend to use. So why are you bothering giving us two and
that was a test? That's what was tested. Yeah.
But it's presented us as if this is still an ongoing. It's presented us as if this is still an ongoing discussion and decision to be made. But you've sounded more this morning as if you've said, which is fine. If you've made a decision, that would be helpful to us to know.
But our recommendation report, which we provided on following the testing that Scott did set out our recommendation. What we've also provided at other times, or perhaps alongside of it, I can't remember, is the information that was used as part of that testing, which the purpose, as we discussed with the committee before, was to understand how people engaged with the guidance. So there was two options that were out there that were part of the rehearsal. The results that came back from that we considered, and we made our recommendation, which was in the report that we provided to committee.
So the letter we received from the Cabinet Secretary in relation to the guidance, it describes an ongoing process until the final version is agreed by the end of summer this year. So it's just, are the two options...
That's all the guidance. That's all the guidance, yes.
So are these two options still live for discussion, or has a decision been made that the proposed guidance will be the guidance that will accompany the census?
So the guidance generally will not be finalised until the summer.
But the sex question in particular?
The proposal for the guidance is as set out, and as I communicated to the committee at the beginning of January, I thought the committee was aware of that.
So why do we get presented with, what's the purpose of the alternative proposed guidance then, if it's, why are we being presented as if it's a
With apologies, I don't have before you what you have been sent by NRS, so I can't answer that.
That's why I addressed the question to Mr Whitehouse initially.
There was two types of guidance that have come to the committee, I think, in the past, which showed what was part of the research. There, in our report, which we put, and our overview report, we then make clear that this is our recommendation, and that was the basis of the conversations that we'd had when colleagues and I were here in January.
So the guidance with the two versions of the sex question that was tested was supplied by NRS in August 2019 to committee.
Yeah, well, it's dated
and
September.
The recommendation report was published in December. So
it's done
at the point that the paper question set and guidance was provided to committee. That was at the point we were at. We undertook further testing and development, and the recommendation report was published in December 2019, which set out the recommendation for the guidance for the sex question.
So it's done then. There's going to be no further testing of the two options. You have decided it is going to be the first.
All the guidance.
I know it's all,
guidance, including all the guidance, will not be finalised till later, till the summer, right? But in terms of evidence-based, looking at the research, because that was what I think the committee wanted to happen, was to look at what would happen and how people would respond to the guidance. And that's where you had the two options, and that was tested at the end of last year. The report of that has been presented to the committee, and based on looking at all the evidence from both the rehearsal experience but also from the research that took place in December, the recommendation is, because that's what the evidence shows us, that although there are issues, and I'm not saying that there aren't issues, and that obviously there are issues around having legal sex, there's some concerns around having self-ID, and that came forward in terms of, you see the content of that in the research report that you've already had a chance to discuss, and you've had evidence on that itself. The evidence leads you from this to say to ensure that you have the best quality and also in quantity of information the recommendation would be that that's what would be in the guidance. So the current situation is, and I'm proposing to the committee, and we did that in the letter to you back in, I think, the beginning of January. So if that's not been evident to the committee, it's certainly evident in the report. We can point you to the sections where it says that, but I'd hope that the committee would have had a chance to go through the report that was presented to you, and which also then said, look, this is what would be the best guidance that would maximise what we're trying to achieve, which is completion of the census to achieve the best quality and to provide the guidance that's needed to ensure that people fill in the census. So we've been very, very open and given you the information.
So it's possibly because, and I understand why it's been described as proposed guidance, because the final decision isn't made until September. Until later this year, September. But I think for the committee, having the word proposed around it suggested it was still up for discussion. But what you're saying this morning is it is really no longer up for discussion. You've done the testing, the evidence directs you towards that decision, and although it's called proposed, the debate about this is over. You'll not be consulting or testing further different options. That's the decision.
There wasn't any, I mean, I don't think there was ever any, I mean, we've done the additional testing that was done in at the end of last year is over and above what has been happening in ONS and elsewhere. There was nothing in that research that led us to think that there was a need for further testing. Had there been, had it not been clear, had there not been, had the experience of that sense, had the research been different, had it led to different evidence, then there might have been a case then to have further testing. But that wasn't evident from that report. And I don't think the report that I think you've already had a chance as a committee to discuss, there was nothing that said, look, we've still got concerns about the content of that research. We still have to do further testing because it's not clear. It seemed, an MD, I think, reading, objectively looking at the report, the conclusions of it would steer it towards the best result would be from the binary question with self-identification, and that's what I've relayed to the committee.
Thank you.
Ross Greer.
Thank you, Convener. Just to go back to the point you made to Alexander Stewart, Cabinet Secretary. Ultimately, this is a question of maximising both the quality and quantity of data that's collected. As the Cabinet Secretary responsible, are you confident this is the approach that would do that?
From the evidence that's before me, yes.
Great, thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Before we do finally move on, I have a supplementary myself relating to my earlier question about the non-response rates, which I pointed out that if you look at page 31 of the ScotSEN research, it points out that for self-identification sex guidance, and this is of the general population sample, 2% said they would skip the sex question in the census if the guidance was used, and 1% said they would not complete the census at all, and it was the same for legal sex guidance. Of course, if you can't just skip the sex question, if you skip the sex question, you can't complete the census, so that basically means that 3% of people wouldn't complete the census. Now, when I raised this with you earlier, you said we didn't know why that was the case, but actually on page 30 of the ScotSEN research, it was very clear. It says, under the heading Reasons Why Some People Find the Self-Identification Sex Guidance Unacceptable, it says a common theme among those who found it unacceptable was that sex is binary and determined at birth, and that consequently there should be a legal basis to any response to the sex question. For some whom had objections, the self-identification sex guidance was viewed as encouraging the notion that sex is a personal choice. So your own report on which your decisions were based was quite clear, contrary to what was said earlier, that people who said that they may not complete the census because of the self-identification guidance were really very clear about why that was. Now, that is the general population set that you tested. Given that you have repeatedly said that response rates are very important to you, it's very clear that if 3% of the general population are saying they won't complete the census, surely that is much, much more statistically significant than a small number of the trans population who have difficulties in completing the census. But you have made a decision based on that very, very smaller group, as opposed to the general population, who quite clearly, and this is before this issue has become very prominent in the public eye, that there's a significant, 3% is quite a significant number of the general population who may not complete the census.
So obviously the ScotSen research was based on people seeing everything, whereas the rehearsal was based on what would be normal domestic completion, which would be online at home without the access to the guidance, unless you chose to access it. In terms of why people, because obviously it was both on the self-identification and legal sex, it was the same statistics. Your point, and you can't assume, I would ask the statisticians to perhaps help me on this as well, but in terms of people saying that they would skip it, as you said, you can't skip. And so you can't then say there'll definitely be 2, and there'll definitely be the 2% that would want to skip if they realise actually you can't skip because it's mandatory, because when you start filling it in, then you can't necessarily add the 2% and the 1% and say that they're all doing it for the same reasons. I think you're right. Some people exactly have said that.
But it says it's very clear what the reasons are why they're skipping it.
Well, some aren't. Some are also because, for some people, they won't complete it for a number of different reasons. That happens all the time in the census.
No, but it doesn't say that in your research. In the research, it says that they're objecting to it because they believe sex is binary and they think it encourages the view that sex is a personal choice. That's what your research says.
So in terms of trying to ensure that people complete this, we're doing it online. It's mandatory. People will not be able to skip. What you can't see, and what the research doesn't see, is that when people are presented with the issue of you can't skip or you can't continue, does that mean they will continue with it? Will they fill that in, or will they not fill it in? You can't. I don't think you can read across on that basis. Is there anything else from a statistical point of view?
I think just one of the points is that around about 3% of the general population said they wouldn't respond to that question, no matter what the guidance was, whether it was the self-identification guidance or the legal guidance. So actually the version of the guidance doesn't change that potential group of people who said they're not that they either would skip the question or
but they were only shown two guidance, which was legal sex and self-identified sex.
Yes.
But you have alluded to yourself that there is a lively debate going on in this issue, and people feel very, very strongly about it on both sides. That's very clear. Have you considered the impact of people from the general population boycotting the census because of this?
Well, there's no indication that there would be that would happen. People are very conscious of the civic responsibilities of completing the census. That question has been able to be filled in at high levels consistently. We know from previous experience there are people for reasons that they don't like completing the census won't complete it. There has to be sensitivity in prosecution of those cases, and there has been sensitivity of that in the past by the Procurator Fiscal in those instances for people for whatever reason just have a general objection to filling in the census, but it's extremely small. But Pete Whitehouse can bring you in on those points.
Yeah. So I think we will be doing a lot of work over the next few months and running up into the census date to promote the benefit of the census and how it's so vital in delivering services, allowing funding formulas to be developed, allowing local charities and third sectors to do their work. So that will be very much promoting the benefit, and we would absolutely hope that all people across Scotland are therefore able to engage in fulfilling that census form, filling the census form and engaging. When we look at some of the other issues that have been discussed, there is a need to triangulate all of this information. These are not things that go, okay, well, that was the one piece of absolute evidence. It is that what we look at past history, we look at rehearsals, we look at the fact that large evidence shows that the vast majority of people can answer the sex question and do so quite happily without any concern. There is a need to provide some guidance. What's clear as well is that when you speak to people in a kind of test situation, people have different views and they express them.
You
and
do have
we
different views, but
absolutely
you have
welcome.
made a decision based on what you say as the response rates of a very small percentage of the population, which is the transgender population, and you have made your decisions based on how they feel about the question, and you have dismissed the fact that in terms of the general population, there is a larger group of people who may not answer the census, but you're dismissing them.
When you can't compare those two figures, what we have is evidence from 2011 and in our rehearsals that this question is very well answered. So people answer the sex question. There is no doubt about that. What we also know from our rehearsal is that some people have questions that they would wish to ask about how to answer it. That's what the guidance is there for. The 3% figure in rehearsal is something where that's useful. It tells us something about how we ensure that we promote the importance of the census and that we encourage people to understand why we are asking the question in the way we are, why it is consistent with 2011, why it's consistent with across the rest of the UK, and therefore that gives people that wider context. And within that sense, we hope and we fully expect that people will be able to engage as they always have done.
And remember, in the rehearsal, 99.5% of the people completed without looking at the guidance. They were not completing it on a self-identification basis. 99.5% of the population were completing the male and female basis, not on a self-identification basis. They were doing it on a self-completion basis, but they weren't accessing the guidance, so weren't doing it on that basis.
I think, Annabelle, did you have a supplementary?
In light of the previous discussion, I was a wee bit unclear. So the text that we have before us of the guidance that you have signed up to now on self-ID for the mandatory sex question, is this the final text? Or is this part of your overall guidance that will be subject to further change?
Yes, that's second point.
The latter. Yeah. What changes will be made to this guidance?
This is our proposed question.
Sorry, maybe to rephrase that. So, as you can understand, you better understand why I'm asking the question. So, you say that the decision's been made, that's the guidance, right? On the basis of the evidence that you say you've used, and convener suggests that maybe some other evidence has been given less weight, whatever. So, that's that. You know, so you've made your decision. So, presumably, there's no further testing. Is that correct? Is there further testing?
Well,
no.
the testing that we did do was exceptional because that wouldn't necessarily have happened, but it's been helpful that it happened.
Well, there was testing, although there wasn't guidance head of test, but in any event, so there's no further testing in this, so that, what would change, what would be the reason to change what you have in front of you? I don't know, I'm just not following the process.
I mean, we have done that engagement. We have come.
Okay, I'm just asking: is this the final text of it now?
From our perspective, yes, for that sex question.
And what does that mean from our perspective? So who would change it?
Well,
I'm just not following the process. Sorry.
The guidance is separate. I mean, that's one of the things I said right at the beginning. In fact, you know, in terms of what the committee's responsibilities, the legal responsibilities in relation to the order, it's through the subjects, which is the order, and then obviously the regulations, which is the questions which follow, and that's the main focus. But I think there has been a strength and an openness, because I think, you know, it's such a, as the convener has said, it's such a live issue that people want to discuss, that I know the committee have got heavily involved in the guidance issue, but your legal responsibility is for the order.
Yes, although, as I said, Mr Matheson did highlight and flag up quite rightly that the guidance sets the legislative context for the question, but not to go for old ground again.
Right, sorry.
Thank you.
That was a different session, yeah.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, convener. We've received some further correspondence from the Sikh Federation of the UK, also regarding the issues that they have raised and also their desire to have the Sikh as an ethnic option on the census. Also, that they're having this dialogue with the ONS also, and they've also raised the possibility of a legal challenge in the Court of Session in Edinburgh. if the ethnic option wasn't available in the census. Can you provide me with some information, please, regarding any dialogue that you've had with the Sikh Federation of the UK regarding the census here in Scotland?
So my understanding is the committee are aware that National Records of Scotland met with Sikhs in Scotland on the 25th of October. They've also engaged with a number of individuals and organisations, including the New Gurdwara Glasgow, Sikh Sanjob, Sikh Federation, Preet Gill, who's the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group, British Sikhs representative, Edinburgh Gurdwara, ECTA Group, Sikh Council UK, the Aberdeen Gurdwara and Lord Singh of Wimbledon. There obviously is a very live issue as to whether some Sikhs want to be able to answer the question not just under a religious basis, but under an ethnic basis. As with other issues, there are different views of that within the Sikh community, and that we know that from some Sikh respondents found the inclusion of a religion under ethnic group itself unacceptable, inappropriate or confusing. But what, and I've asked NRS, how does somebody who wants to say they're Sikh under the ethnic group, how would they answer? And what they'll be able to do is they'll be able to write that in if that's what they want. But that doesn't mean if it was to appear as a tick box under an ethnic, that might then cause difficulties with other members of the Sikh community who find it not, as I said, appropriate, unacceptable and confusing. So it will appear under the religion section as a tick box. It will be possible under the ethnic group to be able to write in Sikh as part of that. But obviously, in terms of ongoing discussions, they've also written to me, and I've agreed to meet with the Sikh Federation as well.
Okay. That's been very, very helpful. Clearly, the Sikh Federation are very very strong in their belief, and they do refer back to a case that took place in the House of Lords in 1983, the Mandela versus Dowell Lee case, also as part of their argument. But if further legal action were to take place, and certainly if legal action were to take place here in Scotland, would that have an effect upon delaying the census taking place in Scotland?
Obviously, it's very serious. We'll keep and we've kept, from a legal point of view, keep a close eye on what's been happening in terms of the other case. But I've set out in terms of the order what we're required to do to meet the timescales to build the digital infrastructure for it. That would cause a difficulty.
Would there be a financial implication to that as well?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, no, thank you. I do have a further question, Convener, on a separate issue.
Yes, of course.
Okay, thank you. It's really just it's more of a technical question regarding it's an issue I've raised in the past regarding the organisations who represent and work with people who are disabled, particularly regarding this census primarily being an online census. I know a dialogue did take place. But is that dialogue continuing with the likes of Dyslexia Scotland and RNIB Scotland and others?
Can I ask colleagues to answer that?
Yes, the conversations are ongoing. Part of the census is a programme of working with all groups in society to understand what public assistance is best available, would be most appropriate to support everybody in terms of completing the census. Those conversations are ongoing.
Okay. That's helpful, thank you.
Is that everything? Yeah, okay. Can I just point to the letter from the Sikh Federation? They seem to be concerned. Apparently, the testing in Scotland was brought into the court case in London by the Cabinet Office, and they mentioned that the cognitive testing of 7 Sikhs in Scotland had led to the position that ONS took, and they're objecting to that. Was your decision based on the testing of 7, just 7 people in Scotland?
Can I ask colleagues to answer that one?
No. There were, in terms of the cognitive testing, we ran a whole number of focus groups. There was 30 to 35 people in the focus groups and a series of focus groups overall. There was a piece of qualitative testing that was done on the religion and ethnic group questions. Overall, I don't have the numbers.
You don't have the numbers?
to hand today, but all of the research material has been published on our website and is publicly available.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. You say that there's different views within the Sikh community. Obviously, we've had this letter from the Sikh Federation, an earlier letter from a prominent Sikh organisation in Scotland. Nobody has written to the committee expressing an alternate point of view. You say that you've made the decision because views are divided within the Sikh community.
People will be able to.
Who are these organisations within the Sikh community who agree with what you're doing here?
Well, we can't. I suppose it's the approach to the census. There's the proactive engagement. I listed all the different organisations that there's been engagement with. I can't tell you which ones were saying yes, it was inappropriate, no, it was inappropriate. But the balance would mean to enable it to be both considered as a religion, which is, I think, the primarily in terms of the focus has been in previous years, has always been on religion. The efforts now to change it, could it be an ethnic, under the ethnic group? It can be. Indeed, in terms of predictive text, if somebody in the other group goes to the other, it will come up. So they're not being, people aren't being prevented from doing that. But again, it maximises the completion for those who want to complete it under that section, but also it's not causing difficulty for those that find it difficult. There's a difficulty with it. I can't. I'm not in a position to tell you which organisation said this, which organisation said that. Yeah,
there is a suggestion from the Sikh Federation that they may take legal action. Mm-hmm. Is that something, I guess, by meeting them, you're hoping to resolve that?
Well, that's, I mean, obviously I got correspondence probably around the same time as you did.
Yes, okay. Sorry, can I put on this letter? Claire Baker would like to come in again.
Sorry, it's just for clarification, because this morning Mr Whitehouse and I think the Cabinet Secretary has suggested the committee were already aware and informed that decision had been made on the guidance for the sex question. But if I look at the letter you sent us on the 18th of December, which was prior to the committee appearance on the 9th of January, the letter says the current sex question testing that which NRS commissioned ScotSend Social Research to carry out is progressing well. I will share the results of that work with the committee as soon as possible. I understand that a session has been set up for the 9th of January to consider this work. So the letter in December didn't tell us we have made a decision on what guidance to include around the sex question.
It was
and
in
I think
January.
I'd have to look back in the official report, but I can't remember the official report. That was
quite happy to take it away and look at what the correspondence said, didn't say. But in January, I was under the impression that the committee had been informed that this was the way forward as a result of the research that had taken place at the end of last year.
Right. That's helpful.
So it wasn't December.
Yeah, the letter did not state the decision had been made, and I didn't think my memory of the session was still the committee engaged with it as if it was an issue for discussion. I don't think it's been clear to us that a decision
well, that's obviously a misunderstanding from.
I accept that. Thank you.
Alexander?
Sorry, it's moving on to a different question area. Is that okay, or do you want
to come in on this question?
So I just wanted to stick on the religion. Thanks, Alexander, and thanks, convener. I'm just wondering how important the religious question is, number 21, because to me, I note that in 2001, 14,052 people described themselves as Jedi. That was more, incidentally, than said they were Sikh, Jewish, pagan or Hindu in Scotland. And indeed, 5.5% of people, it's voluntary of course, but 5.5% of people put no religion down in 2001 and 7% did in 2011. And also, I noticed in 2011 that there are 291,000 people who put other Christian, which is 4 times the number of Muslims, for example. But I'm wondering, if you are going to have a religious question, it does seem to be very vague. So, for example, if you're an agnostic or an atheist, you're kind of stuck between, do you identify with one of the religions that are listed here, or do you put none? I mean, surely if you're going to be accurate, if you want accuracy, you would be asking something along the lines of, do you consider yourself to be atheist, agnostic, and then a list of denominations? And lastly, why is Episcopalian not listed there? There are more Episcopalians with 370 congregations than Sikhs, Buddhists, Hindus, Jews or pagans. In fact, there's more Episcopalians in Scotland than Sikhs, Jews and pagans combined. So I'm just wondering your thinking behind that question and why it's so vague.
Okay, it's not the final question. I think there's some points that have been made, I think, by Ross Gray previously that have been taken on board for change. Big question, absolutely, but it's a fairly fundamental one. And I hate to say is exactly why the last committee at the last census thought it would be a good idea to have engagement early with the committee so that before the order was placed. Now, obviously, the order that's in front of you just has religion, so it's quite, it's a catch-all. And that's what you're going to have to decide whether you agree with or not. But the process that we've gone through would hopefully have been able to flush out some of these fairly fundamental bigger issues, because it's quite late in the day to necessarily address that. But I think your point about Episcopalians is reasonable. Part of the topic guide, way back in terms of, years ago, in terms of, what does MD want in this? I'm not sure whether Episcopalian came up as an issue that people thought there was a need for that, but perhaps officials could give you more information on that. But it's a kind of big question to be looking at such a late stage, if you see what I mean.
I mean, the religion question, as the Cabinet Secretary said, there's been some slight adjustment following conversations with Muslim groups who have asked for certain variation on that question to allow them to write in a more full way. There's a write-in box that allows that to happen. There'd be predictive text which allows people to do that, and that helps with our processing. The question itself is a fairly routine question that's asked on other surveys and provides what data users want. If a data user is particularly interested in a particular aspect of one particular religion, well, some of the predictive text or the write-in boxes will provide that analysis. So this question works. It's a question that is used regularly. We've made some slight adjustment to encourage and enable full participation, and then there's a write-in box which allows that data to be processed quickly and data users to do the more detailed analysis that they wish.
Okay.
So therefore, Episcopalian, people would write another, they would write Episcopalian, and that information would be gathered and that information would be published as part of the reports from it. So it's just not there as a tick box, but you can. Yeah.
I'm just thinking, given the numbers, I'm not an Episcopalian myself by heritage or anything, but I just think, given the numbers of them relative to some of the other groups in here, I would have thought just on reasonableness it should be in. But the main aspect for me is, if I was an agnostic, what box do I tick there?
I think there's none.
Well, none doesn't mean you've no religion. You could be an agnostic, but still have a Presbyterian, Roman Catholic background. All I'm saying is that if it was worded a bit better to say, do you consider yourself to be, in terms of religion, consider yourself to be, and I don't see why agnostic and atheist are completely different. Agnostic means you're not sure, obviously, and atheist means you don't believe. And I think, a lot of agnostics are even, might just identify with the kind of religions they were brought up in, if you like, the denomination brought up in. I just think if you're going to have a question, the accuracy, why ask it if you're not looking to be more accurate on it? And I just don't think I think that question's pretty vague.
Well, again, I suppose it's census use, because obviously part of it is, and particularly for what you have minority religions, there's actually a responsibility for society to make sure that the service support, etc. But obviously, for agnostic atheists, I'm not sure what the service use would be. There might be a kind of capturing society and what it is and what people believe. And you can see that from, I suppose, an academic point of view. But has there been demand for agnostic?
Well, what's the service used for pagans then?
The Pagan Federation, in the development of the 2011 census, approached GROS, as it was then, to look at inclusion in the census. There was a large amount of work done at that point. It didn't get included following the parliamentary process. Again, we were approached for 2021. There is an identified need for information on the pagan community in Scotland. And that's what we respond to. Any changes that we propose for 2021 for any of the questions are all based on the fact that we've got data users coming to us to present a clearly identified data need. We then prioritise those needs because obviously there's a limited amount of questions we can ask.
Okay, thanks, and thanks for letting me know there is a pagan community in Scotland, because I wasn't aware of that, despite been here my whole life.
But that's why the information was shared with the committee over many months, and I know that there's been a lot of focus on the sex question, understandably, but actually all these other issues have been lying there to be engaged with, but we're at the final process.
Okay, thank you.
Alexander.
I'd like to talk specifically about the health questions 17 and 18 that you've got in the census. 17 talks about the general health of individuals and gives a little bit of guidance to what that would be. Number 18 talks about specific types of illnesses that individuals may have, and there's about a 3-page guidance on that. Now, you've talked about guidance today not being used very well by a number of individuals when it came to the sex question. Can I ask, when you were doing some testing on this, how many people used the guidance to try and find out what their health situation was? Because, as I say, you've listed dozens and dozens of ailments individuals may have, and they may not see that as being an ailment they have unless they click onto the guidance.
You answer that, yeah.
Certainly. One of the bits of information that came back to us following 2011 was the question gathers the information that meets the user need, but there was a large volume of write-ins which all had to be coded back, which was a very timely process and didn't come without cost. So the development work for 2021, given that we knew the census would be digital first, was how to present the material that users who have a condition would be able to answer this easily. So this is a slightly differently formatted question online where each of, so from page 51 onwards in the version you have, so under deafness, partial hearing loss examples, there is actually a little link under that headline. So the guidance doesn't come as one. So
the guidance comes specifically as each question materialises. So if you felt that you had a mental health issue or you had a long-term issue, there would be specific guidance to cover that.
Yes, that's correct. So you could access just those list of conditions.
Rather than them all.
Rather than and we did find with the guidance testing that online functionality in the development of the question that respondents preferred that because they could easily see where they should go. But also mainly, if you've got a condition, you might not think of it as a mental health condition.
I've looked at the one there, like you've got long-term, you put blood pressure as a long-term specific issue. Individuals who have that condition may not perceive that they have a long-term condition, but that's what you're identifying within that. The same on mental health. If they have panic attacks or a bit of anxiety, that may be something that they see or others. But my initial question is, when you were testing and when you were going through all of this, did the majority of people look at the guidance?
No, the majority of people actually have no condition and they don't need it. The guidance is there only for those who have a condition and actually need some guidance as to where that condition
but
should be
as
going.
I've identified, if they don't perceive, for example, you've got their long-term blood pressure, someone who has a blood pressure problem may not see that as identifying as a long-term condition. That sounds much more serious, that sounds much more dramatic, that's maybe cancer or an element of that. So you may not be getting the right information if they're not clicking onto the guidance.
People will use the guidance if they feel they need guidance, and the same with all of the questions. I take your point. The testing did show that when we had, with the online functionality for this question, people, and again, some people used the guidance. I mean, obviously with the rehearsal evaluation, the numbers of people that access the guidance are quite small.
And it was easier for people to identify the guidance on the online. Can I ask about those who would not be using an online, a paper copy? Where would the guidance come into that if they were filling in this question as it stands, identifying what the guidance would be for each specific one?
Yeah, there is guidance tailored specifically to the paper version of the questionnaire, which is also available online and different place to the online questionnaire.
But if they're not using the online, it may be the case that as Stuart's already indicated, it may be someone who's got a learning difficulty or a disability or who's not using that facility. So they have maybe someone supporting them to do that, to make sure that you get the correct information. The guidance is vitally important to that individual to make sure that that is put through. And my question is that I think that you could be missing out on some of that if it's not captured and it's not identified correctly.
I understand what you're saying. Certainly the testing we did, we found that having the online guidance did certainly help people categorise themselves into one of the higher level categories that reduced the number of write-ins. Other than that, the question largely is the same as it was in 2011, and I do appreciate that not everybody will read guidance and answer according, and the list is also not exhaustive. These are sort of the categories which came up the most. They've been worked with other existing sort of lists as to how to categorise things like the World Health Organization. But yes, I take your point.
And it will be similar to what it was in 2011
Yes.
when it was all paper-based. So therefore, people needing additional support for anything would either phone up, or that's why you have the enumerators that go around to help people as well, and then they can also they can email, contact, etc. So it's actually, if anything, the 2021, because it is digital online, means that more people can be able to get the support they need, but not everybody. And I think the point about special support for people with disabilities, etc., is we're very conscious, but that was also the case in 2011 and 2001 as well.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thanks. There's just a couple of areas to wrap up quickly that are new areas that I want to ask. Now, there may be an easy answer to this question, but on page 7 of the order, paragraph 7, it talks about the disapplication of liability to penalty for refusing to state particulars re the transgender question, which of course is voluntary. But my understanding was that the sexual orientation question and the religion question are also voluntary, but there isn't a similar paragraph about those areas. Am I just missing something, or?
Scott, could you answer that?
The Census Act 1920, as amended, makes those voluntary. No further subordinate legislation is required in order to do that.
Right, okay, right. So that was when we amended the bill before. I thought we amended it to make transgender voluntary as well.
The bill, so the 2019 Act, leaves the position that there needs to be an exercise of subordinate legislation powers in order to make the trans question voluntary.
Right, as distinct from sexual orientation question.
Which the sexual orientation question is voluntary because that's effectively hard-coded in the primary legislation. The religion question is voluntary because, again, that's hard-coded in at the primary legislation. For the trans question, it was left that an exercise of subordinate legislation powers would be needed in order to make that voluntary. So the bill and the 2019 Act paved the way for getting to where we are.
Because remember, we separated it out, the two. Remember, we separated
we did,
it.
but
and that's a consequence of that.
That's fine. It was just that we thought it was better to check that. And finally, there was another area of debate that the committee had, and that was when we discovered the sexual orientation question, which we'd obviously agreed should be voluntary, appears on the census and includes other sexual orientations. And we had quite a long discussion with NRS around the fact that sexual orientation is very clearly defined in the Equality Act, and we wrote to NRS about that. But of course the census order continues to ask for other sexual orientations, and there are predictive response options which ONS are not using, I understand, which were very unfamiliar to some people. The objection to there were two objections. One is that it suggests that there's another sexual orientation apart from gay, straight and bisexual, which is basically what the Equality Act says, and that causes confusion. That was the first objection. The second one was to do with the predictive text, and if I can just quote Dr. Kath Murray from Edinburgh University, says, a sexual orientation question with overly complex predictive response options, not all of which describe the sex that a person is attracted to, means that less complete information may be collected on the protected characteristic of sexual orientation, which is the reason for asking about sexual orientation in the first place, because it's a protected characteristic. And she goes on to say, for instance, demi-romantic does not tell us whether a person is gay, lesbian, bisexual or heterosexual, so it doesn't give meaningful information. Are you still planning to go down the route of those predictive testing?
I've got some sympathy with that point in question. I do think that there should be a question that's other, that people can then fill that in, as there is with lots of other questions right across the census. I'm less convinced that the predictive text is something that we'd want to pursue, so I'm considering that just now.
Okay, I'm sure the committee will consider that answer. Okay, thank you very much for coming to give evidence today, and we shall now move into private session. Thank you.